Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Provost for inviting both Professor Sawyer and myself this afternoon. I'm going to talk a bit about my work and the interaction between AUP and the work that I'm doing at the moment. So as we all know, AUP is a laboratory for international cooperation and cultural exchange. Our first president, Lloyd DeLameter, was a highly cultivated man, a diplomat who believed that American liberal arts education in Europe would provide students with a very rich university experience. And 60 years later, this is still the case. And all of us at AUP benefit from these rich cultural exchanges within a framework of international cooperation. In fact, so much so that we take it for granted, but this is not the norm. And my work outside of AUP makes that abundantly clear. So, as the Provost said, my teaching focuses on human rights. Human rights are by nature international, but their implementation is always national, as Fred Einbinder knows all too well, our law professor here in the audience today. We have a state-centric UN system which obliges states to sign, ratify treaties, and then hopefully respect them. So as a member of the French National Human Rights Commission, my colleagues and I work to advise and also at times to require the French government to uphold its international human rights obligations. And today I'd like to present an example of our work that has been deeply informed by my experience at AUP, and also in which my students are beginning to become increasingly involved. I find AUP an extraordinarily important sounding board, particularly because the perspective on international cooperation and cultural exchange is so rich here. Our students are much more interesting for me to reflect with than my colleagues on the French Human Rights Commission. They have a broader vision, even though they're much younger. So this is a challenging project that I'm working on. It has to do with deported Ukrainian children to Russia. According to the Ukraine government, 16,226 children have been deported to Russia from Ukraine in the past 12 months. Russia itself has acknowledged transferring 2,000 children without guardians. They call these transfers rescues, medical rehabilitation initiatives, and adoption programs. A study by the Yale School for Public Health has confirmed over 6,000 transferred Ukrainian children who have been subject to forced adoptions, but also torture and sexual violence in more than 43 re-education camps across Russia. So we don't know how many children have been transferred. And it's very important to know that many children were originally voluntarily sent to Russia to escape the bombing by their parents at the beginning of the war, particularly in the Donbass and the southeastern Ukrainian regions. The problem is that once these children arrive in Russia, the parents either lose all trace of them or they are unable to get them back if the parent, for example, would like to move to Western Ukraine. And so these transfers are occurring without full consent. In some cases, there has been consent, but in all cases, there has not been full consent, and in some cases, there's been no consent at all. And as I'm sure you're well aware, most countries in the world have signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Russia is one such country, and such transfers violate nearly all the articles, the clauses of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that Russia has ratified. Now, because this is war, these transfers also violate international humanitarian law, which governs our conduct in wartime. There are two specific areas that I think are most interesting today. The first is War Crime 8.2, which is unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement. And the second is genocide, because Article 6E of the Rome Statute prohibits forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The International Criminal Court has responded by issuing to these transfers by issuing a mandate for two individuals, President Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the National Commissioner for Children's Rights. The mandate is for deportation as a war crime under Articles 8.2a7 and 8.2b8. Now, genocide will probably eventually be added if either one of these individuals is ever brought into custody in The Hague. And Germany has already announced that they will arrest Putin if he sets foot on German territory. It would be, I think, advisable for the French state to do the same. They haven't done so yet. Now, Ukraine is a really interesting case of divided international cooperation. We talk a lot about international cooperation at AUP. We study divided international cooperation in our classrooms. At the UN General Assembly, 141 member states have condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 32 states have abstained, and 6 continue to support Russia. From a cultural point of view, this is also a really complicated situation. And again, it's our training at AUP that allows us to look at a more nuanced version of this problem. It's not a black and white issue. It is a very complicated issue. Kiev in Ukraine was founded by the Vikings in 882, more than 500 years before the founding of Muscovy, Russia. Kievan Rus included much of modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and portions of Western Russia. And according to Timothy Snyder, who's really the leading Ukraine scholar at Yale, the history of Kiev and the surrounding lands embraces certain European trends that are less pronounced in Russia. So essentially, his analysis is that Ukraine is European and Russia is Eurasian. Now, you may or may not agree with this analysis, but it's something to keep in mind because this isn't what the Russians think. The Russians consider Ukraine part of Russia, and it's often called Little Russia. Putin said in a July 2021 speech that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, they form a single whole, and that they are bound together by one language, economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and the Orthodox faith. Now, many of you who read the news know there are a lot of divisions forming along these lines today. So this is a case of profound cultural misunderstanding despite centuries of cultural exchange. It's the kind of cultural misunderstanding that we don't see often, for example, in an AUP classroom. And it's informed by something else that I think we often lose sight of. Russia experienced a traumatic fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and that has contributed to a population decline of 3 million people over the past 30 years. As you're probably aware, most countries are experiencing population increase, or have over the past 30 years. Russia has experienced a decline. That decline has been slightly accelerated by COVID. They lost about 660,000 people to COVID. There's an unknown number of war deaths. We have no idea. And we also know that during war, births are often delayed because we have soldiers who are on the front lines, and we also have draft dodgers. We know that Kazakhstan has declared in September alone that they received 98,000 Russian males, most of them of childbearing age. They were provided with visas to live in Kazakhstan. You also have a very low life expectancy in Russia, 69 years compared to 80 in the EU. So this combination forms a perfect storm. And as your own birth rate drops, how convenient to adopt your neighbor's children. We have research that's been ongoing. Interestingly enough, most of the information on this crisis is open source information available in Russian. And the Yale School for Public Health, for example, has used AI to parse through this information. They've geolocated 43 re-education centers. We think there are many more, but we know the location of 43. Some of them are in Siberia, or there's one in Magadan, which is near Vladivostok. So these children are coming from, say, Mariupol into a holding center in Russia when they cross the border, sometimes with a parent. They're then separated, and then they're sent all the way across this enormous landmass to Russia. This is a complex logistical system with a militarized element. Many of the photographs that are available online demonstrate that there are people in uniform who are working on the movement of these children. And please keep in mind that almost in all war situations, including in Russia during World War II, there's a moratorium on adoptions. It's usually the first thing that happens in wartime because the goal is to track down families and reconnect children with their parents if they're separated. Now, a variety of organizations are tracking these missing children, but there's almost no international organization or coordination to organize their return. And it's surprising to me. And we're slowly but surely making this surprising to the French Human Rights Commission and the French government as well. 308 children have been rescued because they have determined parents or guardians who have reclaimed them physically in Crimea or in Russia itself. Some children have been old enough to organize their own return. Interestingly enough, cell phones often haven't been taken from children, which demonstrates to me that this isn't an evil genius organizing a massive deportation of children. It's a well-organized but fairly loose movement of children out of Ukraine and into Russia. Those that remain in the camps, I fear, may be either forcibly adopted, exploited, or exchanged for high-profile Russian prisoners at the end of the war. Now, most of you know me as a sort of a confirmed Luddite. I work on the regulation of technology in peacetime, but war is different. And I am fully supportive of the use of all open source information to gather evidence. I know that the French gendarmerie also is using the dark web to gather evidence on this. Geolocation tracking is fine with me. Cell phones to contact victims is very useful. And there's been an enormous amount of human-to-human transmission of information as well. In fact, most of the information that organizations have comes from human beings, not from machines. There are also technology-based solutions that will need to be pursued if we're going to eventually locate these children. We have DNA tracing. How we do that DNA tracing, how we organize it, is a knot that eventually we're going to have to untie. Facial recognition technology. Extremely interesting, and in this particular case, very useful because we can project what a child will look like in 2 to 3 years' time from a photograph. And then some Ukrainian parents are demanding microchips from the Ukrainian state to place in their children so that they don't lose them. And I find that startling, to say the least. And so I've been working with my students to devise questions that I can then bring to the French Human Rights Commission to better understand what it is we need to do in order to organize the eventual return of most of these children. The first question our students came up with, this was an exercise that we ran in class last week, is how to encourage Russian citizens to cooperate with the return of Ukrainian children. Some people think that they're doing the right thing by adopting these children. They have very little exposure to Western news. These children need a home, and they are happy to bring them in, and they receive a subsidy from the state to do so. And then if these children were to be returned, which organization or entity should run such a practical project, and with what authority? Please remember that Russia is a member of the UN Security Council and will have the presidency for the latter half of 2023. Clearly, we're not going to get any authority from the UN Security Council, but I believe we need authority to act. What sort of technical guardrails will be necessary for this type of a project? How do we use facial recognition technology, DNA testing? What if parents do implant microchips in their children? What are the ethical guidelines for that? Should all children be returned? Some of them are going to be better off in Russia than they would be to return to a devastated Ukrainian city with no parents and maybe an uncle or an aunt available to take them in with no money. And then if we do get the children back, what do we do with their data once they return? So these are questions that I think I wouldn't have ever been able to get the French Human Rights Commission to come up with, but in an AUP classroom, this is entirely possible. So to conclude, AUP's ethos of international cooperation and cultural exchange encourages our students to formulate really smart questions, to act on our values, to explore creative solutions, and find justice in the case of intractable problems. I've been teaching at AUP since 1988, working with my students to make Delameter's vision the norm, not the exception, for the world at large. So thank you very much.